Tonight we are marking 10 years since the Richmond Hill explosion that killed 2 people and damaged dozens of homes on the south side of Indianapolis. Veteran reporter Rich Van Wyk covered every part of that story, from the initial blast in the Richmond Hill subdivision to all of the trials that resulted in the convictions of those responsible for those explosions. Rich is retired now, but we brought him back in studio because we want to talk about this big story. Rich, thanks so much for joining us.
It's good to be here.
What do you remember about that night of the explosion?
I think the thing we remember most is that it rocked the neighborhood like a bomb. People across the city were trying to find out what happened. I was at home watching television, trying to get my head around just how big this could be, how many people were killed, where the fire was, what's happening. This explosion was so big, people thought that a plane had crashed, that maybe a military plane had accidentally dropped a bomb on the neighborhood. The seismograph that keeps track of the Earth's activity and looks for earthquakes at IU Bloomington actually registered the explosion. One of the witnesses said it sounded ungodly. Another woman said standing in the scene of the crime that occurred out there was like standing in death.
And by the time you got to the scene at Richmond Hill, what was the damage like? How horrific was this?
It was something that I had never seen before, and it's hard to quantify. Pictures didn't do justice to the injustice that occurred in that neighborhood. I think we had to look around and realize that 30 homes destroyed. Some were literally obliterated. They looked like a pile of rubber, that was all. Another 80 homes damaged. Many were knocked right off their foundations. They had roofs peeled off, the side of housing peeled off. The damages totaled eventually some $4.5 million or close to it. You're looking at 200 people that were suddenly homeless, and sadly 2 people who perished.
And I think the coverage early on in the first few weeks was about the couple, Dion and Jennifer Longworth. This was the couple that was living next door, and all the people that were injured, all the homes that were damaged or destroyed, and then certainly the first responders who were the heroes to go in and get all these survivors out.
This was probably one of the most compelling and tragic stories that occurred throughout the whole ordeal. Jennifer and Dion lived next door. The force of the explosion killed Jennifer instantly as she was lying in bed on the 2nd floor. The house collapsed 1 full floor. Where's Dion? Unbeknownst to firefighters, he was trapped inside this debris. They already had their fire lines out to another house. It was too late to move their fire lines. And they could hear Dion's voice. They could see him through a hole in the collapsed damage between the basement and all the other burning debris. They could reach out and hold his hand, but they couldn't save his life. It was a terrible scene in which firefighters who lived to save lives had to be pulled away from the burning house so they wouldn't be injured or killed.
It's such a tragedy to lose these 2 Hoosiers in this blast. And so as the days and weeks then, as you're covering this story, at what point do you realize and do you hear investigators talk about this wasn't an accident, that this was intentional?
Investigators were suspicious from the get-go. And it didn't take them very long to figure out how this fire started. There's something called a pressure relief restrictor regulator type device that goes on the gas line of every home. It's there to lower the gas pressure to prevent explosions, prevent fires. That regulator was missing from the home's plumbing system. Also missing was the shutoff valve for the gas-fired fireplace. Without those 2 devices on the gas line, natural gas could just flood and fill that house to the fact that it had an impact or the effect of hundreds of pounds of dynamite going off.
So now investigators at this point in the case are seeing that this in fact looks to be intentional. What else do you remember as you were covering this big story about what investigators found inside of Monserrate Shirley's house?
They found gasoline or evidence of gasoline that had been poured into the garage around the water heater, theoretically to help set off a fire. They found the remains of a microwave oven, which they believed had been rigged to trigger the fire. Start with a small explosion, lead to an explosion that takes down the house. What was missing was surprising. Personal effects, valuable items, jewelry, big screen TVs, all of them had been removed from the house. In fact, also removed from the house was the cat. The cat was put in a kennel. And later on in this case, the prosecutor accused Monserrate Shirley of caring more about her cat than she did the lives of her neighbors.
Let's go ahead and remind you of the three key people in this big story. You've got Monserrate Shirley, then you have Mark Leonard, and then you have Bob Leonard. Tell our viewers again who these people were and their roles.
We'll start with Mark Leonard. Mark Leonard was the ringleader. He made a career of scamming women who didn't think a lot about themselves. He befriended them, became their lovers, took their money. Bob, his half-brother, rigged the home to catch fire. Homeowner Monserrate Shirley went along with the scheme. She helped set up an alibi. The couple went to a riverboat casino the night of the explosion before it occurred. Shirley put her cat in a kennel for the weekend. Again, the prosecutor accused her of caring more for that cat's life than she did the lives of her neighbors.
So at what point during the investigation do you learn that this is all about trying to collect insurance money?
I think it was very early on. Shirley had money problems. She had 2 mortgages on the house. She owed more than twice as much money on the house than it was worth. The plan was to cash in on a $300,000 insurance policy. The trio's 2 previous attempts to burn the house down, by the way, failed. They had to try a third time.
So eventually prosecutors end up charging these 3. So Monserrate Shirley, Mark Leonard, and Bob Leonard all go on trials. What do you remember about covering it?
The 3, as you mentioned, were charged and tried separately. The evidence, though, was so overwhelming against Mark Leonard that he had almost no defense. His attorney argued that this was, in her words, a stupid and selfish insurance fraud scheme that went horribly wrong. She argued that Leonard never intended for anyone to get hurt. The scores of witnesses testified. There were tears and courage as firefighters and residents testified about the horror of that night and what it did to their homes and their lives. Remarkably, after weeks of testimony, it took only jurors 4 hours to convict Leonard of 45 counts of arson, 2 counts of murder, and other charges. Bob Leonard was convicted of similar charges. They were both sentenced to life for prison without parole. Monserrate Shirley, she struck a plea bargain with prosecutors, testified against the Leonards. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison. She's expected to be released in 2036.
And Mark Leonard died while he was in prison, didn't he?
That's right. He passed away while in custody.
And Monserrate Shirley and Bob Leonard still in prison at this point, serving out their terms. So as you look back, Rich, on covering this big Richmond Hill story, 10 years later, what sticks with you? What are your final thoughts?
I think the enormity of what occurred out there is still hard to believe. If this were committed for political or ideological reasons, instead of just pure old-fashioned greed, it probably would have been considered domestic terrorism. I think listening to the people tell their stories and have the courage to tell their stories in court, and every time they sat in court, there was a map showing all the houses and properties in Richmond Hill. They put an X as to where their house was or had been, and slowly the map entirely filled out. But the neighborhood has rebuilt itself over 10 years. Some people decided to rebuild their homes, come back, resume their lives. Others couldn't get out of there fast enough. They were emotionally, financially, physically drained by what happened. There's 3 empty lots in the development right now. Monserrate Shirley's lot is still emptied. Another lot belonging to someone we don't know, just a victim of this. One of the residents I spoke with said, "You never get over anything like this. You just learn to live with it."
10 years after Richmond Hill, Rich Van Wyk, who covered that story from beginning to end, joining us in studio. Rich, thanks so much for your coverage over the years, and a happy retirement to you, my friend.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for joining us.